There's so
Yes,
many
my
that...
search works, but
and the search works for me as well.
yeah. Right. So actually, I think we should get started. No, or Natalia, do you want to?
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah. Okay. Okay. Sounds good. So so welcome everyone to this CEPR Virtual I/O seminar. So today we're very happy to have Leslie Marx from Duke University's Fuqua School of Business. And so Leslie is going to be talking about countervailing power. So before we start, let me briefly remind you of the basic rules of the seminar. So we're going to start with 60 minutes of presentation. This will be followed by 15 minutes of formal discussions. So Patrick Rey from Toulouse and Joe Montes from Lausanne have kindly agreed to discuss the paper. And finally, you're going to have 15 minutes of Q&As. So if you have questions during the talk, you should type them into the chat. I'm going to read them during breaks in the presentation. During the Q&A sessions, we're going to try to allow you to ask your own questions, right? So in which case, the host of the seminar, so Natalia Fabra, is going to promote you to speakers so that we can see you ask your question. I should remind you that the seminar is being recorded. So if you do not wish to be recorded, you should not ask questions. So I think that's pretty much it as far as the rules are concerned. So so Leslie, the floor is yours. Thanks for agreeing to present, and yeah, take it away.
Thank you very much, and thank you very much, the organizers, for giving me the opportunity to present in this forum. The paper I'm going to talk about is called Countervailing Power. It's joint work with Simon Lurcher, who's at the University of Melbourne. And this is ongoing work, and so I'm really be grateful for any comments and feedback that you have. Sorry, okay, technology, good. So the concept of countervailing power figures prominently in antitrust debates. The Australian guidelines give a nice definition. We have countervailing power if pre-merger prices are distorted from competitive levels by market power on the opposite side of the market, in which case a merger may actually move prices closer to competitive levels and increase market efficiency. This idea of buyer power and countervailing power has a long history. It's described as the oldest of economic problems, that of mitigation or regulation of economic power by Galbraith. Mary Lou Septo in an Antitrust Law Journal article talks about how it has significant jury appeal. So in a legal context, it's often embraced as if it had talismanic power. But it's been controversial, challenging to invoke this type of argument, controversial since the beginning, because there's no, as Stigler put it, no explanation why bilateral oligopoly should in general eliminate and not merely redistribute monopoly gains. As Snyder describes it, it's difficult to model bilateral monopoly or oligopoly. So if we're going to have a model of countervailing power, we're going to need, in order to have countervailing power, we're going to need a model where we have, for countervailing power to increase social surplus, it's going to require a model with an explicit price formation process that accomplishes two things. First, the bargaining power affects not only the division of social surplus, but also the size of the social surplus. And so what we're going to talk about today is a model that has exactly these features. To give you a quick overview of the model, we'll come back to this in more detail momentarily. But we're going to have a procurement problem with one buyer and some number of suppliers, one or more suppliers. The buyer's value and the supplier's cost are going to be independent draws from continuous distributions with compact supports. The distributions will be common knowledge, but the realizations of the buyers and suppliers types will be their own private information. We'll have a model of the price formation process. We're going to model it as an incentive-compatible, individually rational, deficit-free mechanism that maximizes the weighted sum of buyer surplus and supplier surplus, where those weights on buyer and supplier surplus are going to reflect the relative bargaining powers of the agents. We'll see that the weights are going to affect the division of surplus when ex post trade is possible, and also whether or not ex post efficient trade is indeed possible. Our price formation mechanism with bargaining weights, it's going to encompass the Chatterjee and Samuelson's K-double auction for the particular case where you have bilateral trade, so just one supplier and uniformly distributed types. And then more generally, it's going to arise in equilibrium in an extensive form game in which you have a fee-setting broker that's running a competitive procurement for the buyer. And can also be set up in terms of axiomatic foundations. The key insights, things we'll talk about today. First, that bargaining power affects both the distribution and the size of social surplus, and that typically ex post efficiency is going to be impossible, both when the buyer has all the bargaining power and when the suppliers have all the bargaining power. And social surplus will be maximized when you have equal bargaining weights among buyers and suppliers. It's going to be useful and important for some of these ideas to make the distinction between agents' productive power, how high their values might be, how low their costs might be, and the bargaining power, their ability to move the price formation process in a direction that favors them. And then we'll talk about implications for the analysis of horizontal and vertical mergers, investment incentives, and bargaining externalities. Got a couple slides on overview of the results, and then there'll be a moment for questions. So we have on countervailing power. We're going to talk about how it is distinct from, but related to, bargaining power. In order to have countervailing power, you're going to have buyer power that is present before a merger, so that there's something for supplier power to countervail. And then it's going to have to diminish, but not vanish, as a consequence of the merger in order to have social surplus increasing effects of countervailing power. We'll show that a merger that levels the playing field by equalizing bargaining weights can improve social surplus and may actually make the first best possible when it was not possible prior to the merger. When we think about countervailing power as a merger defense, it's going to require a model of a price formation process with a role for social surplus increasing bargaining power, some articulation of what form the buyer power is going to take in this process, evidence that the buyer power exists. So for example, if the market operates in, can be viewed as a procurement auction, then for example, the observation that the buyer uses handicapping to favor or disfavor certain suppliers over the other would be evidence of buyer power, or random winner selection with positive probability that would arise in a case where you have non-regular virtual types with ironing, where you're going to get ties with positive probability. And finally, some plausible explanation for why the merger diminishes buyer power. In some additional results we'll be able to talk about today related to vertical mergers, so vertical integration, we'll see that it eliminates the bilateral trade problem within the integrated firm. So you're going to have efficient trade with your integrated supplier, but can create a bilateral trade problem even when the first best is possible prior to vertical integration, because it's going to exacerbate trade problems, inefficiencies in trade between the integrated firm and outside suppliers, with the result that there's in general no basis for a presumption that vertical integration is beneficial. On investment, we'll have two extensions. One where we add a possibility of investment, one where we add multi-unit demand. We add investment, we'll think of those in terms of non-contractable investments that improve the agent's distributions in the first order stochastic dominant sense. Then if you had complete information and an efficient price formation process, you would get hold up. And so inefficient investments in the usual Grossman Hart Moore type world. But in our setup, we have private information, and the privacy of the information is actually going to protect the agents against holdup. And we'll see that in that setup, if you have a merger with countervailing power, that can actually improve incentives to invest. And in the second extension, we'll be able to talk about bargaining externalities. We'll add in multi-unit demand with quality differences, and we'll see that bargaining externalities arise naturally in that setup. Okay, that was our warm-up. So if there were questions at this point, we could talk about that, and then my
just
proceed.
Sorry, so one question just came up from João Granja. So he's asking, can you say a word on how you think about post-merger bargaining weights? The empirical literature has been struggling with that.
On the post-merger bargaining weights, we're going to take the bargaining weights as a parameter in the model. And so you can start with the case where the bargaining weights are the same post-merger as pre-merger. And then we'll be able to say whether it's possible that the post-merger bargaining weights could adjust enough that would allow you to have social surplus increasing countervailing power.
Thank you.
There'll be a chance for probably that same question to come up again later, so
sure.
Feel free to come back to that. So I'm going to talk about the setup and then spend a little bit of time talking about what our price formation process is with an illustration and a short discussion of implementation, and then get into the results. So just one slide on the setup. We've got N risk neutral suppliers, each with unit supply. The calligraphic N will be the set of all the suppliers. Each supplier I has some cost, which is an independent draw from distribution GI with support from C lower bar to C upper bar and some positive density little g. And so the payoff to a supplier will be the payment that they receive. And if they produce, then they incur their costs, CI. The buyer is a risk neutral buyer with unit demand. The buyer has some value V that's an independent draw from distribution F with a support from V lower bar to the upper bar and a positive density little f. We're going to assume that there are gains from trade. So just assume that the biggest value is greater than the lowest cost, just so that we're in a world where there's actually a possibility of trade. And then the buyer's payoff is going to be its value times the quantity it purchases. So here, think of at most one of these Q's being equal to 1. So the value, if there's trade, minus the payment that the buyer has to make. The distributions are going to be independent. Common knowledge will satisfy regularity. We could relax regularity at the cost of having to iron all the virtual type functions. And the realized types of the agents are their private information. Okay, so that's the setup. Any questions in the setup? Probably more questions on the next part. So we'll talk about our price formation process. So the price formation process, that's going to tell us how prices and quantities traded are determined. And it's going to be at the heart of and typically exogenous to any economic model of exchange. So we might, in an oligopoly or perfect competition model, think in terms of the Carnosian or Walrasian auctioneer or a bargaining protocol or an auction format. In all of these cases, the price formation process is a mechanism. So it's a mapping from the fundamentals to quantities and prices. In our setup, it is going to very explicitly be a mechanism in the mechanism design sense. So we're going to assume that the price formation process is a mechanism that maximizes expected weighted welfare, and we'll be specific about what that is momentarily, subject to incentive compatibility, individual rationality, and that there's no deficit. The outcomes are going to be the agent's expected payoffs, and even though the mechanism will maximize weighted welfare, we're of course going to evaluate the outcomes according to the actual welfare, the expected social surplus. So we're going to have bargaining weights. So W will be a vector of bargaining weights, and it's got a weight for the buyer and weights for each of the suppliers, each of them in 0, 1. We'll assume that at least one of them is positive. And then weighted welfare is the buyer's weight times buyer surplus plus all the supplier weights times the supplier surplus. And as we mentioned, the price formation mechanism is going to be the mechanism that maximizes that expected weighted welfare subject to individual rationality, incentive compatibility, and no deficit. So just to be precise here, given a mechanism, so an allocation rule and payment rule, and type realizations for the buyer and the suppliers, the ex post surplus of the buyer. So here, let's think about the allocation rule being equal to 1 for at most one of the suppliers. The buyer is going to get the value times the allocation minus its payment. Supplier I gets its payment minus the cost when it supplies. And that means that our ex post weighted welfare would be the buyer's weight times the buyer's expected surplus, times the buyer's surplus, and plus the supplier's weight times the supplier's surplus. Our price formation mechanism is going to be the mechanism that solves this problem, maximize expected weighted welfare subject to ICIR and deficit. And just to be clear about what all of this is, we can introduce the interim incentive, interim expected quantities and payments for each of the agents. So little q hat B is the buyer's expected quantity when its type is Z, when its report to the mechanism is Z, and all of the other agents report truthfully, taking the expectation over all the other agents, and similarly for the supplier I, taking the expectation over the buyer's value and the cost of the other agents. Then we can define incentive compatibility, that the interim expected payoff under truthful reporting being greater than or equal to your interim expected payoff for any other possible report to the mechanism for both the buyers and the suppliers. Individual rationality is your interim expected payoff is greater than or equal to 0. And the no deficit constraint is that the expected surplus to the mechanism is greater than or equal to 0. We've stated all of this in terms of interim base incentive compatibility and interim individual rationality. In our setup with independent private values and single dimensional types, everybody's risk neutral, there would also be an ex post implementation of the mechanism. So you could also impose these incentive compatibility and individual rationality at the ex post level. Any questions?
No questions.
Okay. It'd be a good place to have audience feedback, so I'll try to judge how things are going. So here's our mechanism. We're going to maximize expected weighted welfare, so just those constraints. So notice, you can already notice here that if you have equal weights, so if the buyer weight and all the supplier weights are equal, then you're just maximizing total surplus subject to no deficit, and that's going to give you the second best outcome. So the second best constrained efficient outcome. When you have unequal weights, well, maybe not. You may not be getting the second best outcome. In order to define what this mechanism is, it'll be useful to have the notation of the virtual value and virtual cost functions. So we'll use phi to be the virtual value function. So it's the usual, these are the usual virtual type functions from a mechanism design setup. So phi is the virtual value function, gamma I is supplier I's virtual cost function, defined in terms of their distributions. And then it'll also be useful in terms of notation to define the weighted virtual type functions. So given any parameter in 0, 1, we'll define the weighted virtual value function to have this coefficient 1 minus a on the hazard rate term. And similarly for the virtual cost functions. If just notice that it's would be more typical, a la, for example, Meyerson and Satterthwaite, or Gressick and Satterthwaite, to have this coefficient be a rather than 1 minus a, but it's going to clean things up a little bit for us just to have it defined in this way. Using incentive compatibility now, we can write the expected weighted welfare in terms of these virtual types and the allocation rule. So essentially we're substituting out for the payment rule using incentive compatibility. And so that means that our allocation is going to maximize this expression, where this term here, V minus the virtual value function, that's going to be the buyer's surplus. The term virtual cost minus the cost, that's going to be seller I surplus. So these are multiplied by the weights. And now we've got to take into account the no deficit constraint. And you can show that the budget surplus in an incentive compatible mechanism is going to be the expected value of the virtual value minus the virtual cost times the quantity. And we will have a multiplier on that no deficit constraint. We can maximize this with respect to Q point-wise. So for every value and cost, you're going to want to trade with, if this expression is positive and not otherwise. Notice that the rho multiplier on the no deficit constraint is the shadow cost of the budget surplus. And that tells us that it always has to be bigger than the maximum weight, because if it were ever smaller, you would want to just transfer all of transfer an infinite amount to one of the agents with the higher weight. And that would violate the no deficit constraint. So in an argument that's the same thing used in Meyerson and Satterthwaite and Gressick and Satterthwaite, the optimum here has to have the smallest multiplier, the smallest row, such that that no deficit constraint is satisfied. It's going to be convenient for us to work instead with the multiplier itself with 1 over the multiplier, which we're going to call beta. And we'll let beta star of the weights be the largest beta in the possible range, such that no deficit is satisfied. Remember that multiplier was going to be between the max W to infinity, and so beta is now on the interval 0 to 1 over the maximum weight. And that tells us now our price formation mechanism with weights W is going to have an allocation that we can write here as depending on the agent and the beta star. That's going to be equal to 1 if this expression here is satisfied and 0 otherwise. So what is this? You're going to trade with agent I if and only if the virtual value for the buyer, this weighted virtual value for the buyer is greater than the weighted virtual cost for seller I. And seller I is the agent with the lowest weighted virtual cost among all of the agents. So the mechanism will be to trade with the agent with the lowest weighted virtual cost if and only if that lowest virtual cost is less than the buyer's virtual value. And then just to give an example here, the case where the buyer has weight 1 and the suppliers all have weight 0, that's the buyer optimal mechanism. So it's the buyer holding an optimal option that does not run a deficit. So the constraint, the multiplier is going to be at its lowest possible level. Beta will be at its highest level equal to 1. And similarly, the case where the buyer has weight 0 and each of the suppliers has weight equal to 1, that's also going to be the supplier, jointly supplier optimal mechanism also does not run a deficit. And so the beta is going to be equal to 1 there as well. We'll finish off the payoffs and then we'll do an illustration to be able to see what's going on. The allocation rule that we just described is going to determine the expected surpluses up to the constants that are the indeterminate expected payoffs of the worst off types. So the buyer with value V lower bar and a supplier with cost C upper bar. So given, we need to say also these constants, given an expected budget surplus of pi, so that's defined not including the constants, and letting M denote the number of agents that have the bargaining weight equal to whatever the maximum of all the weights is, we're just going to divide up that any available surplus that's going to maximize our weighted surplus. In order to maximize the weighted welfare, we need to be giving any additional surplus only to the agents with the highest weight. The specification here where we're dividing it equally among the agents with the highest weight, that's arbitrary. And finally, we have our price formation mechanism with bargaining weights W. It's going to generate payoffs, generate expected payoff for the buyer equal to the payoff to the worst off type, plus a term, we can write the expected payoff in terms of the expected value of my connection is unstable. Hopefully you can still see me, my computer's complaining. But in terms of a term that's the integral of the allocation rule and also for the suppliers with the payoffs to the worst off types given by that previous expression. Okay, I've got an illustration now, which hopefully will clear up all questions.
So maybe just a quick one from Silvana Krasteva. She's asking about the linearity of the cost functions, right? So I mean, now we have unit demand here, but in principle, you could have trading probabilities, right? Or non-unit demand. So she's asking whether you thought about non-linear cost functions for your trading mechanisms.
The cost, the supplier's cost is a draw from a distribution. And so we have a single unit supply. So your cost is for supply extension will allow for multi-unit supply. If we're going to have multi-unit supply, I think we can handle that if it's a commonly known parameter that's the rate of the slope of the cost function. We have to be careful if we get into a world of multi-dimensional types.
Yeah.
Okay, so just to illustrate, let's think about a bilateral trade setup. So we have one supplier and one buyer. The buyer and the supplier both draw their types from the uniform distribution on 0, 1. Then what's the buyer optimal mechanism in that world? That would be the buyer making a take or to leave it offer to the supplier. And the buyer optimal mechanism has a buyer with value V, make a take or to leave it offer of V over 2 to the supplier. In that setup, the buyer's expected payoff is a 12, the supplier's expected payoff is a 24th, and that's this dot here on this graph. That would be the expected payoffs in the buyer optimal mechanism. The supplier optimal mechanism has the supplier making a take or leave it offer to the buyer, and the optimal take or leave it offer for the supplier in this setup would be its cost plus 2, the supplier's cost plus 1 divided by 2, and that would give the supplier expected payoff of a 12 and the buyer expected payoff of 1/24. So that's this stuff down here. So these are the payoffs that arise in the buyer optimal and seller optimal mechanism. What about intermediate bargaining power? We're going to allow intermediate bargaining power. You could, of course, have randomized take it or leave it offers, and that would allow you to achieve any of the payoffs on this dashed line here between our two extremes. But you can do better. In particular, if you look at the Chatterjee-Samuelson K double auction with K equal to half, that has the buyer submit a bid, the supplier submits a bid, they trade if and only if the buyer's bid is above the supplier's bid, and they're going to trade at the midpoint price. In that auction, the payoff of both buyer and supplier is 9/128 in our uniform case here. And so the K double auction gives you a higher payoff than anything intermediate between the two buyer optimal and supplier optimal mechanisms. Let's connect this now to our mechanism. You can have a K double auction for any K between 0 and 1. They trade whenever the buyer's bid is bigger than the supplier's bid and at a price that's weighted intermediate, so K times the buyer's bid plus 1 minus K times the supplier's bid. For the uniform 0-1 case, we have nice expressions for the optimal bid functions for the buyer and the supplier, and that gives us the allocation rule. You're going to have trade whenever V is sufficiently large. Satisfying this expression here. And you can trace out all the possible outcomes in the K double auction from K equal to 1, which is buyer optimal, to K equal to 0, which is supplier optimal, and that point in the middle. And as you can see, the bargaining power in this model affects not only the division of the surplus, but also the size of the total surplus, with total surplus being maximized at a K equal to a half. Now, in our price formation mechanism, if we define the price differential to be the bargaining weight differential to be the difference between the buyer's weight and the supplier's weight, normalized by whatever the maximum is, then you can show that the allocation is going to be invariant for all bargaining weight vectors that have the same differential. And so we can write our allocation rule as a function, instead of the bargaining weight vector, as a function of the parameter delta. And this delta is going to be somewhere between -1 and +1. -1 when the supplier has all the bargaining power, and +1 when the buyer has all the bargaining power. Then for any K associated with a K double auction, there is a bargaining differential such that the outcome that you get in the price formation mechanism with that bargaining weight differential is equal to the outcome that you get in the K double auction. So for delta equal to 1, we're getting the same outcome as a K equal to 1. Delta equal to 0, that's equal bargaining weights, no differential. You're at the K equal to a half outcome, and delta equal to -1 is for K equal to 0. So our price formation mechanism in a setup with one buyer and one supplier and uniformly distributed types is the same as the K double auction.
So let me maybe ask a few questions from the audience here. So there was a question from Larry Wade who was asking whether sellers are treated in a discriminatory way here.
This example has just one seller.
Right. So before the example.
Yeah. So yes. So the distributions of the suppliers are common knowledge, and those distributions might be different. And to the extent that the agents are going to be evaluated in terms of their, let me get to here. The agents are going to be evaluated in terms of their virtual cost functions. And these virtual costs, the subscript I here, the virtual cost for supplier I depends on supplier I's distribution. And so there is discrimination here among the suppliers in the sense that a supplier with a different distribution will be evaluated with respect to a different virtual cost function.
And one more question from, so Andre Vega has a few questions. So let me just ask one. So he's asking whether there is a link between your bargaining weights and something empirical, such as, demand elasticities, or, so I guess it's related to the first question we got at the beginning.
Here we're just taking the weights as an exogenous parameter, but it's a good question. We haven't tried to make that link.
Right, yeah, so that would be interesting.
But that's a good thing for us to think about. Yeah, okay. I agree.
Thanks.
So sometimes economists might achieve greater comfort with a model of price formation process if there's a non-cooperative game that at least under some assumptions generates the outcome as an equilibrium. So lots of examples of this. So just in light of that thinking, first note the connection between our model and the K-double auction for the special case of one supplier and uniform distributions. And then more generally, the price formation mechanism that we have generates an outcome that's an equilibrium of an extensive form game with a fee-setting broker. And I'm not going to talk much about it here because I want to get on to other results. But if you have a game where a broker is running a clock auction procurement for the buyer in exchange for a fee, building on the Lurcher and Niedermeyer setup, then we're going to get implementation of our price formation mechanism. So in that game, the broker is going to set potentially discriminatory, along the lines of Larry's question, auction rules and a fee schedule. The buyer will set the reserve price. The broker will then run the auction with this reserve given to him by the buyer. And then if a supplier wins that via clock auction procurement, if they win for a payment P, the buyer's going to have to pay P to the supplier and also pay the fee, sigma of P, to the broker. And you can show that the outcome of the price formation mechanism with bargaining weights W is a Bayes-Nash equilibrium outcome for this fee-setting extensive form game if the broker's preferences are also involved in weights W. Okay, so I'm going to try to talk about horizontal mergers. Good. Any questions? So talking about mergers, first, how are we going to model mergers? We're going to model a merger of two suppliers, say suppliers 1 and 2, as creating a merged entity whose cost has the distribution of the minimum of the two merging suppliers' costs. And so that the distribution of the min of two independent draws from G1 and G2 is given by this distribution G hat. And then the merged entity has the virtual cost function associated with that. And so if we focus, for the talk, I'm going to focus on a merger of symmetric suppliers. So the two merging, we'll assume that the two merging suppliers have the same distribution. The other suppliers might have different distributions, but the two mergers will have, two merging suppliers have the same distribution and the same bargaining weights. Then you can show that the virtual cost of the merged entity evaluated at the minimum of the cost of the two merging suppliers is bigger than the minimum of the virtual cost of the pre-merger suppliers. And that also holds if you have a weight, an A that's less than 1. And so what's happening? You're getting reduced trade by the merged entity relative to the pre-merger suppliers because their virtual cost is going to be higher. And it's the same thing that's going on in a monopsony pricing problem where the optimal take it or leave it offer by a buyer with value V in the facing suppliers with virtual cost function gamma would be this price P. But if you had a merger of those suppliers, so they're now drawing from, or they now have a different virtual cost function, the optimal take it or leave it price is going to be lower. So you're going to make a lower optimal price to suppliers drawing from a stronger distribution. So just reminding you here at the top that if the weight on supplier 1 times the beta star was less than 1, that would mean that the virtual cost function for the merged entity is strictly higher than the virtual cost for the pre-merger suppliers. So we're going to start with bargaining power fixed, so only productive power effects. Pre-merger will have some beta star. If W1 times beta star is less than 1, then that means that the merger is going to reduce trade by the merging suppliers. That's going to reduce revenue. That's going to harm the buyer and harm society, reduce expected social surplus. And if that beta star is less than 1 over max W, is the budget constraint was binding before the merger, then it's going to be even binding even more so after the merger. And so we're going to require a further reduction in beta star. What does that mean for the rivals? The rivals benefit from the reduced trade of the merged entity. So they're better off now that there's greater discrimination against the merged entity, but they're going to be harmed by any reduction in beta star. The merging parties benefit from the reduction in competition, but they're going to be harmed by the reduced trade and by the reduction in beta star. So the merger is going to harm the buyer and society. The effects are ambiguous for the rivals and the merging parties. On the other hand, if W1 times beta star is 1, in that case, the virtual cost functions are the identity functions. They're just equal to the true costs. So when virtual costs are equal to costs, in that setting, the merger causes no change in the allocation rule. It's neutral for all of the agents. So considering only productive power effects, a merger of symmetric suppliers with bargaining weight W1 is neutral if W1 times beta star is equal to 1, and otherwise it reduces the buyer's expected surplus and expected social surplus. So the merger is bad for the buyer and for society, but it's possible that bargaining power effects go in the opposite direction. So once we separate productive power effects and bargaining power effects, we're going to have the possibility that supplier power can countervail, that increases in suppliers' bargaining power can countervail the productive power effects. Let me give an illustration here, and it'll be useful to define this frontier, which we're going to call the Williams frontier. So Steve Williams has essentially this idea in an earlier paper. So if we have bargaining weights, and let's let the weights for the suppliers, for our purposes here, be all equal to one another. So all the suppliers will be symmetric bargaining weights. Then again, we can write our allocation rule just in terms of the bargaining differential between the buyer and the suppliers. If we write US as a function of that bargaining differential as the sum of all of the payoffs of the suppliers, then we can plot this frontier that has total supplier surplus on the horizontal axis, buyer surplus on the vertical axis, and map out as delta goes from 1 to -1, the frontier of possible payoffs for the buyer and total surplus for the suppliers. And you can show that this frontier is concave. The concavity of that frontier tells you that a change in bargaining weights that moves them closer to symmetry is going to weakly increase social surplus. So anytime you move your bargaining differential closer to 0, then you're going to have an increase in total surplus. That means that a merger that levels the playing field can potentially increase social surplus. So let me give a picture of that. So this figure has one buyer and 2 suppliers. So we're going to start with 2 suppliers, which is why the frontier isn't symmetric like it was before, because our horizontal axis is capturing the joint payoff of 2 suppliers. And we can map the Williams frontier as delta goes from 1 to -1. And now let's have a merger. So now all the agents here are drawing their types from the uniform distribution on 0, 1. Now we have a merger. Now our 2 suppliers are going to merge. Now we have 1 supplier, but drawing its type, drawing its cost from the distribution of the minimum of 2 uniform 0, 1 costs. And we have a new frontier that is rotated down relative to the pre-merger frontier. And notice what can happen here. So suppose you have a merger and the buyer had all the bargaining power. So you were at delta equal to 1, and after the merger, the buyer still has all the bargaining power. The social surplus would be reduced. But if, as a result of the merger, the supplier, instead of being two suppliers competing for the business of the buyer, you now have bilateral bargaining. You've got one supplier and one buyer. And in that setting, the price formation process now has equal bargaining rates for the buyer and the supplier. Then you would move to this different point, the delta equal to 0 point on the post-merger frontier, which has higher social surplus. So if mergers can potentially change the price formation process, and a merger combined with an equalization of bargaining rates is no more harmful to expected social surplus than the same merger with no change in bargaining rates, and in some settings is going to increase expected social surplus. Talking about necessary conditions for a countervailing buyer defense, this countervailing power argument comes up in legal settings. Notice that a merger the merger is bad for the buyer. Countervailing power is extra bad for the buyer, because then you have the reduction in the competition among the suppliers, and the remaining suppliers then have increased bargaining power. So in order for a countervailing power defense of a merger to make sense, it's got to be that the competition authority is putting some weight on social surplus as a policy objective rather than just buyer surplus. It's got to be that pre-merger the buyers have some buyer power, have bargaining power. They must have greater bargaining power than the suppliers, so that an increase in supplier power is actually movement towards the equalization of the powers. And there's got to be some retention of post-merger buyer power, because if the buyer power is going to need to diminish but not vanish, so that you're not simply going from a world with a dominant buyer to dominant sellers. I'm going to skip the merger guidelines comment.
Yeah, sorry for interrupting. So I just wanted to ask a question from Nikita Rokaski. Right, so Nikita is asking, so if we think of the direct mechanism as a replacement for a market game, how should we think about bargaining weights? Why are the bargaining weights not affected by the merger via the mapping between the equilibrium in the original game and the direct mechanism that implements this equilibrium?
I'm not sure I understood the question. So,
so I think so pre-merger, you would have this direct mechanism, which is implementing, yes. Right? So I suppose let's keep this mechanism fixed, right, post-merger. So wouldn't that imply a change in bargaining weights?
It doesn't have to. So you can have, if it could, or it might not. So you could have the pre-merger bargaining weights could be every agent has a weight equal to 1. And then post-merger, it could still be that all of the remaining agents have weight equal to 1. So the effect of the merger, you can have, of course, the vector of bargaining weights, there's 1 fewer weight post-merger because you've lost a supplier. Yeah. But the differential between the buyer's weight and the supplier's doesn't have to be affected by the merger. But it might.
So I think what Nikita is trying to do is hold fixed the pre-merger mechanism, and not change it post-merger?
The mechanism is gonna have to change in a sense that your optimal mechanism, the mechanism that maximizes buyer and supplier surplus subject to no deficit, is generally going to be different when the distributions of the suppliers change.
Yeah. No, okay, so that makes sense. I think perhaps we should move on. I mean, you only have 12 13 minutes left.
Yeah, good.
Yeah, okay.
Let me talk about vertical integration, and I want to make sure I get to the literature. So vertical integration, vertical mergers are traditionally viewed favorably, but this view ignores potential effects on the price formation process itself. So in our setup, you can model a vertical merger as having the buyer vertically integrating with supplier one means that the buyer is going to draw its cost for internal production from that distribution, from supplier one's distribution. And we'll assume that the integrated firm has no agency problem. So that means that this integrated firm, that firm's willingness to pay is going to be the minimum of whatever the buyer's value is and the cost with which it can produce internally. And then we'll fix the bargaining rates here. In that setup, if you have only one supplier and overlapping supports, so that we would have the case of Myers and Satterthwaite inefficient bilateral bargaining problem, then vertical integration is going to get rid of the bilateral bargaining problem, give you efficient trade, and so vertical integration is going to increase social surplus. But if you have two or more suppliers and non-overlapping supports, so all the values are all bigger than the cost, you're going to have efficient trade before the vertical integration. But after vertical integration, now the buyer is drawing its willingness to pay from the cost distribution because it could supply internally. And so now you do have post-integration a bilateral bargaining problem. You have the Myers and Satterthwaite problem of inefficient trade. And so that's going to be a case where you have vertical integration decreasing social surplus. Once you're vertically integrated, the vertically integrated firm is sometimes going to source internally, even though one of the independent suppliers has a lower cost. Vertical integration is often thought to be efficiency enhancing, but here vertical integration can take what was an efficient procurement problem and turn it into a bilateral trade problem, where you have the usual impossibility of efficient trade. Let's skip this and talk about this application. No, actually, I'm going to skip this application and talk about investment. Investment incentives feature prominently in a number of policy debates and have a central role in the theory of the firm and the usual Grossman-Hartmore tradition that assumes efficient and complete information bargaining, and that creates holdup on investment. In our setting, the private information is actually going to protect agents from holdup, where investments are going to be efficient if and only if the price formation process is efficient. So the setup, the extension to allow for investment would have every agent being able to make investment at some cost, some increasing in convex cost, where we'll assume that there's stochastic dominance. So we get first order stochastically dominant for the buyers and dominated for the suppliers. And then you can show that in our setup, due to different bargaining rates, efficient investments are going to be a Nash equilibrium of the simultaneous investment is efficient. So you don't have a binding no deficit constraint. So efficient under focus mechanism had dominant strategy implementation. If we were going to have efficiency and dominant strategy incentive compatibility is going to require that every agent be the residual claimant to the social surplus of its reported type, meaning we're equivalent to a VCG mechanism, but we know that this mechanism is going to have a deficit if we're in the case where the no deficit constraint is binding in our problem. So this is the same condition as for efficient investments in the Hatfield-Kojima commoners paper, where you have efficiency plus dominant strategies is equivalent to efficient investment. That means putting that together with vertical integration, overlapping supports, investments are going to be efficient if and only if there is vertical integration. So that vertical integration is going to promote efficient investment. But with two suppliers and non-overlapping supports, investments are going to be efficient without vertical integration, but not with it. So you have vertical integration disrupting efficient investments. So with one supplier and overlapping supports, vertical integration promotes efficient investment, but with two or more suppliers and non-overlapping supports, vertical integration disrupts efficient investment. That as an obstacle to achieving efficient outcomes. The ideas go back to Stigler, captured in Meyerson, and there's this literature on bilateral trade, Meyerson and Satterthwaite, Williams and Gressick and Satterthwaite, that are capturing this idea of private information resulting in efficient outcomes. So we are kind of staying in that tradition, but adding to that framework multiple suppliers and the bargaining wheels. And in this kind of Meyersonian IPV setup, you get a tractable model and principled approach. We're going to have risk-neutral buyers and suppliers. The types will be independent, single-dimensional, with continuous private information. And we're going to focus on incentive-compatible, individually rational, and deficit-free market mechanisms. These assumptions are sufficient to generate this profit efficiency trade-off that's going to be kind of critical to the lessons in our work. But it's also interesting that there are also the kind of unique known assumptions that give you that. So this setup is not arbitrary in itself. And so let me just note that if you lose risk neutrality, then you have Maskin and Riley and Matthews showing that the upper mechanisms are going to depend on the particular nature of risk aversion. Without independence, you have results of Khmer and McLean showing that there's no profit efficiency trade-off when you have correlation. If you lose private values, then you've got Metzetti's work talking about how you're going to need additional restrictions in order to get tractability and to get this profit efficiency trade-off. If you lose one-dimensional types or continuous types, then there are going to be other tractability issues going forward. So we're staying within this setup, which provides a tractable principal model for looking at these bargaining problems with incomplete information and allowing you to capture this profit efficiency trade-off. There's lots of literature that's looking at countervailing power and buyer power going back to Galbraith and Stigler. More recent work by Snyder, and then Simon and I have a paper that's looking at buyer power in particular. Most of the literature, existing literature, is not trying to capture, is not focused on the same approach within these this incomplete information framework, where you have the payoff efficiency trade-off that we're looking at here. There's lots of literature that looks at incentives for investment that are very closely related to the results that we're getting here. That the incomplete information models of Vickery, Clark-Groves, Green and Holmstrom, and the Hatfield-Kojima commoners results are very closely to the results that we're getting here. The complete information models get starkly different results, where the private information is important for preventing the agents from being held up. More recent work that looks particularly at the relationship between Rigoletti and Julian Lefebvre. And then there's quite a bit of recent literature looking at bargaining let me just call out the Ho and Lee paper that's looking at a health markets framework and shows that insurers, after consolidation, have greater bargaining power vis-a-vis the hospitals that they're negotiating with. Last slide. So in conclusion, we're looking at this incomplete information setup. It's a natural framework for island extraction, allows you to look at the price formation process and its efficiency properties, and allows you to incorporate a dependence on bargaining powers of the agents. You naturally get social surplus increasing countervailing power. We talked about that. Naturally get socially harmful vertical integration. You get this relationship between incentives to invest and the efficiency of price formation that differs quite starkly from the implications of investment setting and with complete information. And some of the questions that we're already hinting at this, that for buyers, because then you'd be able to see a raising rivals cost argument when you have vertical integration. But what determines the bargaining power? We show here that it could be independent of prices and distributions and reflected in the price formation process, not so much in the level of prices, and determines the scope for countervailing power.
Okay. Yeah, so thanks very much, Leslie. So we're going to move on to a discussion. So our first discussant is Patrick Ray from Toulouse. So Patrick, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Natalia, Nicola, and all the organizers for this excellent initiative and for giving me the opportunity of discussing or launching the discussion of Leslie's and Simon's paper. This is a very interesting paper. As Leslie said, it addresses this countervailing power issue, which is quite an old issue, and yet it's still very much alive and has recently attracted a renewed interest. Now, they show that this issue that can be addressed and they generate new and interesting insights. Now, in the process, in order to address this issue, actually they make two types of contributions. They propose a new framework for modeling bargaining in multilateral situations, and then they apply it to mergers. So I will first comment on the bargaining model as such, and then I will move on and comment on the applications to mergers. If I have some time, I make a couple of comments on the investment extension. So they develop a framework which accounts for frictions that may prevent reaching an efficient outcome. Here, the frictions are private information, incentive compatibility. So this means that you cannot reach the first best efficiency, typically, not always at least. You can reach you can build a constraint Pareto frontier, constrained by incentive compatibility, and essentially I view their bargaining model as showing that how you can pick any point on this constraint Pareto frontier and relate it to the bargaining weights that they propose. In particular, my understanding is that even though they portray this in terms of you have this third-party intermediary, this broker, you can actually accommodate ex post budget balance for every realization of the valuation and the cost, and therefore you can think of this as really a trade mechanism. There are no brokers, no intermediaries. You only have the parties. They have to decide, the buyer and the sellers. They have to decide who is going to trade and at what price. So this is very nice. They come up with a very nice insight out of this, which is that the more balanced the bargaining ways, the more likely you are going to achieve greater efficiency. So they relate the balance of bargaining power with the level of efficiency that can be achieved, which is a nice insight. A couple of comments on this. So it would be nice to compare this with alternative types of frictions. A couple of them come to my mind. You can have some various forms of contract incompleteness. So, you could have linear tariffs, let's say, if you have multiple units, so double marginalization. Here, the Pareto frontier may actually be, have a slope which which is pretty steepy. So it's not clear, you may end up more often with giving all the bargaining power de facto, or picking the point that is the most favorable to the buyer, because so as to minimize the scope for double marginalization. So it would be interesting to see, to compare the two. You can have limited commitments in the framework. You can have, bilateral efficiency versus multilateral efficiency. So it may be interesting to extend this further. And I think conceptually it seems possible from 1 to n to m to n type of relationship, which some other frameworks do not allow. So it would be nice to go in that direction. Now, the role of the outside options would be, it would be interesting to compare, this approach with alternative approach that put more weight on the role of the outside options. Here, in a sense, the outside options are exogenous. You pick, everyone is free to not to trade, but then you pick, point in the Pareto frontier in this. But in practice, so as part of the bargaining, the fact that trying to maintain outside options, default options, and so on is part of the bargaining process. It may be also interesting to discuss this there. The other thing is, even though this is it's going to be applied to mergers and so on, where typically the buyers are often intermediaries. They're not final users, so it will be, there as well. It may be interesting to add maybe not in this paper, but for the next sequel of papers, I see many papers coming out of this. Maybe interesting to look at this direction, in that direction. Mergers, and this. First, so when we talk about mergers, the first question is what is the criterion to evaluate a merger? Two criteria are typically discussed in the literature and in practice: consumer surplus versus total welfare. Here, the focus is on total welfare, but it may be interesting to at least briefly say, what happens if we were to talk about consumer surplus. And my understanding, but maybe I put it wrong, would be that there you get the kind of a classic insight that a horizontal merger between suppliers is bad, a vertical merger is good. So by contrast, when you focus on total welfare, then you have a much more nuanced implication. Starting with a merger, an upstream merger between suppliers. So you show that the impact is on total welfare is ambiguous. On the one hand, if you eliminate the competition, here you are going to increase the informational rents of the merged entity. That's bad. That is going to reduce trade. That's also bad. But as a result, it may be the case that the buyer is going to react to this, or as you say, your beta parameter react to this, and as a result, it may be even bad for the rivals, which is something that typically we tend to overlook when we look at this. And then you use your framework to talk about countervailing power, and then the way you frame it is, what if the merger is going to change the bargaining ways, which I think is a nice way of. Of course, it raises the questions, and there have already been some questions on this, on how do you measure, how do you assess this, and I'm sure there will be more questions on this, but at least it provides some avenue for tackling the issue. And then you show that indeed you identify the conditions in which such countervailing power moving closer to the balanced bargaining, to the equal bargaining wage could generate an efficiency defense. Now, again, there it would be useful to talk about, do some robustness or have a discussion of comparing this with the conclusion with alternative types of frictions, like a double marginalization associated with linear tariffs or alternative. So where the picture may be a bit different. Vertical integration, very briefly. So you note very nicely and very elegantly that it does solve a problem for the emerging parties, but it may create problems for the others. And that, I think, is pretty much in line with what we have from the literature on vertical integration and foreclosure. But it's nice to show that you can have this even in a very neat and simple framework where you ignore the downstream interaction that may go. So even when treating the buyer as a final user, so that's a nice twist. I was suggestion I would have is that you could use your framework as well to look at the merger between buyers. So, for example, there's this debate about supermarket chains setting up buying agencies. So even if they don't compete in the markets, they look at, they have different customer segments, or they are operating in different countries sometimes, but still they join forces on the buying side. And then the question is whether it's good or bad and so on. So you can probably use your framework to tackle this kind of issues. And then, of course, in the context of vertical integration, sometimes those buyers are competing intermediaries, which are another dimension. I think my time is exhausted, so I will keep the comments on the investment and do this later.
All right. Yeah. Thank you very much, Patrick. So the second discussion is João Montes from Lausanne. So João, the floor is yours.
Okay. I suppose this is good. Okay. Thank you, Leslie, and the VIOS crew for giving me this chance to discuss this, and for Patrick to take away some of my comments already. So since the time is limited, I'll just collect a few thoughts. Okay, so the paper contributes to the buyer power literature. What do we know? We know that to get some welfare effects, we need to add a distortion, as Patrick also mentioned. So the early work in this direction looks at complete information, and the distortions usually come from non-contractual investments or bargaining over linear unit prices or something like that. So this paper has a different distortion, which is incomplete information. There's very few papers out there on this, and I think this is very important and relevant, and thing to think about. But extending the notions of bargaining power to incomplete information is really, really not obvious. Okay, and this paper, there's a very nice and interesting route. So it takes this family of mechanisms that maximize a welfare function, but this welfare function is weighted, and these weights reflect the bargaining power. So if the function puts all its weights on the buyer only, then the buyer has all the power, and if the welfare function puts no weight on the buyer, then it maximizes the welfare of sellers, and so the sellers have all the power. And you can get anything in between across the spectrum. I think that that this is a very nice way to think in terms of mechanisms to introduce this incomplete information. Now, once we accept this mechanism as a reasonable description of the price formation, the results in the later sections follow. But what I would like to spend some time on is share some thoughts on the mechanism itself. I'm gonna try to be quick, but I still need you to just pay 1 minute of attention. Okay, so for people who are out there, some numbers, but very few. So consider a situation where there is only one buyer with a value of 1 and 2 sellers with a cost of 0, both of them. So I think most IO types agree that the price will be 0 in this setting, a logic along the Bertrand lines. Okay. Now, suppose that this cost is instead a draw from an interval from 0 to epsilon. Okay, and it could be with private information on the realization of this draw. So we expect the price to be somewhere between 0 and epsilon, but in all cases, it should not exceed epsilon, okay? So seller competition would ensure that the buyer gets a low price, regardless of his haggling and bargaining power or whatever, okay? And so what is really on the table that will be shared between the buyer and the sellers through bargaining, not through competition, but through bargaining, is just this epsilon. So in a sense, only the epsilon should really be affected by the bargaining power. Who gets that epsilon? this is what the solution concept like the core would tell us. And this seems in line with, our intuition. There are incomplete information extensions of the core, and they carry similar messages. So incomplete information is not the issue. We're kind of getting troubled here. So then I try to see what happens with your mechanism. Okay, I hope I understood, but if I'm going to say something not correct, then I can always rely on the excuse that I have 2 small kids running around. But so if I think what I did is correct, because it's in line with what you say in footnote 15, which is, let me just look here. So the case where all the sellers have all the bargaining power is the same as that with a single seller with a cost equal to the cost of the 2 sellers who make a take it or leave it offer to the seller. So your mechanism tells me that in this situation, so that I described above, even with incomplete information, in the limit, you could get that the buyer needs to pay 1 to get the goods. Okay, so in some sense, it's not only epsilon that is going to be determined, how to share epsilon that is determined by the bargaining weights or power, if you want, is the whole unit is actually up for grabs. Okay, and so these, in my view, suggest that the mechanism may be missing a fundamental ingredient to study market competition. And my suggestion is, I think this needs a little bit more elaboration. It's not a killer, in fact, I can see a parallel here to, to at the end, some insatisfaction, but also a lot of rewards with the work that uses the Shapley value under complete information. Is that in the problem above, the Shapley value also lies outside the core. And so exactly, the Shapley value also cannot capture this notion of competition that comes with the core. And as such, the weighted Shapley values, you can use weighted Shapley values. This is perhaps something we could take offline, but I do think there are some parallels with the predictions you're getting here on several dimensions and weighted Shapley values. Remains a question that, for instance, Andre Vega raised first and other people touched later, but what is power? In the typical bargaining settings, with different implementations, we managed to relate this to the cost of capital, patience, and stuff like that. But here, power is really a black box. At least I could not grab a discussion on that. So to finalize, I think my key message is that I like the approach of the mechanism. I think this is an important, rich methodological contribution. The tool itself, I think it needs a little bit more elaboration and exposition, in particular of what could be its limitations, okay? In particular, if you are suggesting to do, as our guys seem to be pushing for policy recommendations, then I do think that a little bit more, spend a little more time on what could be the limitations is important. So once this mechanism is accepted, then I actually find the rest of the analysis very, very interesting. I like, for instance, the efficient investment result very much. And I like the one on inefficient vertical integration. So that vertical integration can render first best unattainable, even though it was achievable before integration. I think this is the best application of the Myers and Satterwhite bilateral trade problem and that I have seen. And I think I'm going to use it when I teach these hopefully next year in the PhD course. So that is very, very nice. Thank you. I'll log off now.
All right. Yeah. Thanks very much, Joao. So Leslie, would you like to take a few minutes to react to your discussions?
Yeah, thank you very much, both of you, Patrick and Java. I really appreciate the careful reading and the comments. We're really excited about this paper and hoping to make it better and take on board all the comments here. Let me respond briefly to one thing that Patrick said about their existing implementation that satisfy the no deficit constraint ex post. So like realization by realization where you never have a deficit. We haven't finished working that out, but I think going with what probably makes the most sense is a Khmer-Reardon style mechanism that's going to give you, we can implement our mechanism with that kind of setup. It's going to give you the no deficit constraint on a realization by realization basis. You could also use AGV, d'Abriment, Jaraberet, Arrow type mechanism, and that would also give you the no deficit constraint exposed. And I think you're seeing the appeal in that is then it feels really like a trade mechanism because you don't have the intermediary there breaking the budget. Yep, so that is a project for us. Jean, let me just, on your example, where you have the buyer with value V and then the suppliers with very small costs. In our mechanism, if the suppliers had all the bargaining power, they know that the buyer has a value V, they're going to make a take it or leave it offer of V. That's, that's the buyer's value. So in our setup, yes, they would extract all of that difference if they have the bargaining power. But if the buyer has all the bargaining power, then the price is going to be very low. So it's going to, you can, depending on what the bargaining weights are, it would swing that in one direction or the other. But all excellent comments, and we need to think more about all of the things you've raised, including the limitations of the work, and so we look forward to doing that.
All right, thanks, Leslie. So we have a question from Giancarlo. So we try to, right, who's been promoted to speaker. So Giancarlo, go ahead.
Thank you for the promotion. I still get promoted at my age. So Leslie, very interesting. But you go through this very elegant mathematical categorization to policy prescription, and we know how judges in antitrust react to bargaining models, right? So you want to have a clear intuition of you can explain in word. And I was trying to look at it in the paper. I still didn't fully understand the basic economy intuition. So my understanding is that if you have more symmetric bargaining positions, the set of joint realization of V and C that overlap, so that both incentives to trade are satisfied, is larger, in the sense that if you have an extreme allocation either one side or the other of the bargaining power, then one party has an incentive to drop out of trade too often, and that reduces social welfare. And so the whole pie. Is that intuition behind the elegant mechanism you put together?
Yeah, I think you've got it. If you think about holding an auction, you're an auctioneer and you're going to hold an auction. How do you get higher expected prices? By setting a reserve price, by setting a binding reserve. And so the way you get more out of the auction is by setting that binding reserve that actually causes trade to happen less often. It increases the set of types such that you don't get trade at all. And so that the way you skew, the thing that skews the bargaining process towards the buyer or towards the seller is going to have the effect of involving less trade. The same way that binding reserve price helped the auctioneer, but reduced the efficiency of the auction and reduced the probability of trade. I agree 100% that the judges, if the judges are struggling with getting on board with Nash bargaining, then we have some articulation to do in describing our mechanism.
I'm not a lawyer and still had a little bit, struggling with intuition. So I think you should write the intuition clearly in the paper, which I didn't find actually in the paper. So I think that's very important steps between between the model and the policy implication. Well, thank you very much for clarifying.
Yeah, thank you. That's excellent feedback. I appreciate that.
So there was a short question from Santanu Roy, so I'm just going to ask it myself. So Santanu was asking whether you can speculate on what would happen if costs were correlated So how would correlation affect the implication for mergers between suppliers?
I have to think through
Yeah.
what correlated cost that you have in measure. Well, if the two suppliers' costs were perfectly correlated, then the merger, you don't get any benefit of the merger because the merged entity's cost is the same, but you get the reduction in competition. We could work through something like that to try to build up that intuition.
Okay, thanks. So I'm just looking at this. I don't see any other questions. So I think we should call it a day. So yeah, thanks very much, Leslie, for presenting, and Joe and Patrick for discussing, and Natalia for hosting. So thanks a lot.
Thank you very much, Trevor. I really appreciate the opportunity to get the feedback. Feel free to send me an email if you have other comments.
Thank you.